In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. In 2020, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow.
Good evening. Welcome to our Sunset Series. Tonight, I'm very happy to welcome Dallas Jones. He's the Vice Moderator of the governing body of the Federated Church of Orleans. And tonight's topic is the origins of the Eastham congregation. You're in the governing body of the Federated Church of Orleans. How does the Federated Church trace its origins back to the Eastham congregation?
Well, Tom, Congregationalists, when they talk about the church, they're talking about the gathered community of believers. So they're talking about the congregation, not the building. The congregation that meets now on Sundays at the Federated Church of Orleans is the same congregation that had its origins back almost over 375 years ago in Eastham. It all began in 1644 when 7 of the most prominent families from Plymouth and their families, total of about 49 souls, moved to an area called Nauset on the Lower Cape. They bought the land from the Nauset tribe, and it includes what we would now think of as Orleans, Eastham, Wellfleet, and Truro, and a little chunk of Chatham. In order to establish a town there, they had to have a church and a minister, so the first thing they did was to build a church. In 1646, the Nauset Congregational Society was formed, and the town was established. A few years later, it changed its name to Eastham. This was the first church on the Lower Cape. It was about 20 feet square. We have a model of it that was built by George Katz. It was built of native red oak, and a couple of the planks from it are still available and still can be seen, were preserved in the Eastham Tool Museum. Okay, they give a real sense for how solid this building was. It looks more like Fort Apache than it does like a white steepled New England church that dominates popular imagination. Instead of windows, they had slits to fire muskets through to repel attackers. No attacks ever came, but they were prepared. The church was located next to Old Cove Burial Ground, which can still be visited. It's on the eastern side of Route 6, just south of Fort Hill. A beautiful, very small old cemetery with amazing tombstones dating back to the 1600s. Life was hard in those times. Attendance was mandatory. Membership in the church was mandatory. Families had to travel considerable distances through all kinds of weather, mostly on foot, to get to church. We have a large mural-sized painting on the back wall of our sanctuary at church that reminds us every Sunday of what the hardships were in those times. It shows a pilgrim family with children in tow, struggling through snowdrifts, battling against the wind. It always reminds me not to complain about driving 15 minutes through heavy traffic to get to church in my air-conditioned or heated SUV.
That's quite a winter scene we're looking at there.
It is. The first ordained minister of the church was Samuel Treat, and he looms large in the history of the church. He was a graduate of Harvard who took over what was by then the Eastham Congregational Society in 1671 and led the church for 44 years, a record that still stands. He was a big man with a big voice. It was said that he could be heard a great distance from the church, even in the howling winds. Deacons at the time described him as a friendly man, but his sermons were typical of the time, Calvinist to the core, harsh, long, and full of hellfire and damnation. More unusual for the time, he took the trouble to learn to speak and write the Nauset language, and ministered to the tribes in the neighborhood. He befriended them, he preached to them, he went to their houses, and in time there were 500, quote, praying Indians, unquote, meeting to worship in separate meeting houses. As more people arrived in Eastham during Samuel Treat's tenure, the population density began to move toward the south. A South Parish was created, and Eastham built a new church and meeting house there in 1718. In 1797, the South Parish became the separate town of Orleans. So the church of the Federated Church of Orleans is now standing on the same spot that it was originally built in 1718. The 1718 church lasted for over 100 years. In 1829, it was knocked down and a new building was put up. And it's the building that you see now. As you drive down Main Street, Orleans, toward Nauset Beach, you'll see the familiar cupola on the left as you go by.
So, what are some tangible differences between the church, the congregation, the church then, and now, the church you're a member of now?
Back in the day, the church had an iron grip on society. Membership and attendance on Sundays was mandatory. Those who, quote, wonderful phrase here, slothfully do lurk at home on the Sabbath were punished. They could be put in the stocks. I've heard ministers refer to these days as the good old days. Only half joking, I think. By the time of the Revolution, which is when our earliest records go back to, the church's hold on daily life had loosened considerably. Attendance was no longer mandatory, nor was membership. This book here is one of the earliest record books we have for the church. It includes many different things, including disciplinary procedures and the minutes of the meetings that the church had about that. So the church was still doing things that would shock us today, I think, to keep control. They had to rely on moral persuasion and the threat of withholding communion to bring people back to the fold, but they didn't hesitate to do that. If a member complained to the pastor would meet with the church officers and decide whether it should be brought in front of the whole congregation. This was, after all, a congregational church. If it was brought in front of the whole congregation, they would judge whether the person was guilty or innocent. If the person was deemed guilty by the congregation, a committee, usually 2 or 3 people, including the pastor or a deacon, would visit that person and try to persuade them to see the right path and try to get them to repent and to throw themselves on the mercy of the church. It's hard for me to imagine opening the door and finding 3 deacons or other somberly clad people there about to accuse me of moral turpitude of some kind. In any case, the records are very interesting, and they can be seen in the comfort of your own home on the Eastham Public Library website. If you look under Federated Church of Orleans, this very book here with some very quaint old writing and the handwriting of the 18th century by the pastor of the time, Jonathan Bascom. Some of the complaints that were made, they varied from not baptizing a child to not attending church to excessive drinking. Drinking was okay, but excessive drinking. One doctor was called on the carpet because of his excessive drinking, and he refused to repent until the day he died, when he apparently was showing signs of wanting to repent. The church, even though they were carrying out these disciplinary measures that we would find uncomfortable today. I mean, can you imagine? You've been in churches and leading churches all your life. Can you imagine calling up one of your parishioners to the front of the church and laying charges of moral turpitude on them? Personally, I can't imagine getting up in front of a church in those circumstances. They were not loath to do that, but when they met with people, and from the minutes, I think it's very clear that they did this in a spirit of compassion. They did it with a genuine effort to find justice and to exercise mercy, and in the final analysis, to forgive. They wanted to forgive, and in several cases, people came back, confessed in front of the church, repented, and were told that they're welcome back into the bosom of the church. I should reassure any listeners who might be thinking of coming to visit the Federated Church of Orleans that we very rarely call people up in front of the congregation these days to charge them with moral laxity of any kind. And in fact, we are an open and affirming church with a reputation, I think, for tolerance and good works.
People want to visit the website of the church. What is the website?
The Federated Church of Orleans .org. We get you to our website. If you want to listen to sermons, to listen to the service on Sundays, it's on YouTube under the Federated Church of Orleans.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. This is now, what year would this be for the Congregational Society founded in Nauset in 1646?
376 years.
Well,
And counting.
And counting, and building to your 400th
Headed
eventually.
for the 400th anniversary. Absolutely.
Thanks very much.